December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent beneath a heavy blanket of snow, its ancient pines bowing under the weight of ice. At dawn, the stillness shattered. German artillery thundered across the ridges, shells tearing into American lines. It was the opening blow of what would become Hitler's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. In the white haze of the counteroffensive, German infantry advanced with their trusted Karabiner 98k rifles, weapons that had served the Wehrmacht since the beginning of the war. Bolt action, accurate, lethal in the hands of a trained marksman, the Kar98k was the standard of German firepower. Each shot demanded a deliberate motion. Fire, lift, pull, push, fire again. For decades, armies had accepted this rhythm as the heartbeat of infantry combat. But in the Ardennes, they faced something entirely different. From the American lines came a new rhythm, one that roared with relentless speed. The sharp crack of German rifles was drowned beneath the rolling thunder of semi-automatic fire. Squad after squad of American soldiers raised their rifles, the M1 Garand, and unleashed a storm. The Garand spoke in bursts of 8, its en-bloc clip feeding round after round with mechanical precision. Snowflakes melted in the muzzle flash, empty brass casings scattered across the frozen ground. For every one round fired by a German, 5 or 6 shots came back from the American line. It was not just firepower, it was dominance. To a German soldier peering through the pine trees, the experience was shocking. The instinct to rush forward, to exploit a lull between enemy volleys, was useless. There were no pauses, no gaps to seize. The Americans' rifles spat continuous fire, as though every infantryman carried his own light machine gun. Accounts from the battlefield speak of German squads pinned down, unable to maneuver. Veteran soldiers, once confident in the superiority of their training, were stunned to find their advance halted not by tanks or artillery, but by the sheer volume of fire from ordinary riflemen. The Kar98k, elegant in design, was suddenly a relic of an earlier age, a weapon too slow for the furnace of modern war. For the American GI, the Garand was more than steel and wood. It was a shield and a hammer, a weapon that gave the individual soldier the power to dictate the pace of combat. Veterans later recalled the sense of confidence it instilled, the knowledge that they could lay down more fire than the enemy, that they could hold a line even when outnumbered. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the snow-swept forests echoed with its metallic voice. To the Germans, it was a sound of disbelief. To the Americans, it was the sound of survival, and of victory yet to come. The M1 Garand was not merely a rifle. On those frozen battlefields of 1944, it revealed itself as a revolution, a weapon that changed the very language of infantry combat. Long before the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes echoed with its thunder, the M1 Garand began as a vision in the quiet workshops of an American armory. Its story was not born on the battlefield, but in the restless mind of a man who refused to accept that infantry combat must always be limited by the slow cadence of bolt-action fire. John Cantius Garand was no ordinary inventor. A Canadian-born machinist who immigrated to the United States as a child, he grew up surrounded by industry in New England. By the 1920s, he had made his way into the halls of the Springfield Armory, a place steeped in the legacy of American firearms. Reserved in manner but relentless in work, Garand was consumed by a singular obsession: to design a rifle that could fire as fast as a man could pull the trigger, without sacrificing accuracy or reliability. At the time, the world's great armies remained married to the bolt-action rifle. It was reliable, proven in the trenches of the First World War, and demanded less complexity from factories and training schools alike. Yet Garand saw the future. He believed that a semi-automatic rifle, one that reloaded itself with every shot, would transform the battlefield, giving ordinary soldiers the power to deliver sustained fire without interruption. The challenge was immense. Early designs for semi-automatic rifles across Europe and America faltered under the stress of mud, dust, and rapid firing. The mechanisms jammed, broke, or grew too heavy to be practical. Garand experimented tirelessly, testing gas-operated systems that could harness the expanding gases of each cartridge to cycle the weapon. He filed design after design, tinkering with balance, weight, and feeding systems. By the early 1930s, a prototype emerged that promised what others could not: durability, simplicity, and deadly efficiency. But innovation alone was not enough. The halls of the U.S. War Department echoed with arguments. Many senior officers were skeptical of abandoning the dependable Springfield M1903 bolt-action rifle. Others questioned the cost of equipping an entire army with such a sophisticated weapon. For years, the debate raged, between progress and tradition, between visionaries and bureaucrats. Garand remained steadfast. His persistence won allies among forward-thinking officers who recognized that America's strength lay not only in numbers, but in technological edge. In 1936, after years of trials and revisions, the U.S. Army officially adopted his rifle. The weapon bore his name, the M1 Garand. It was a milestone unmatched by any other nation at the time. While Germany clung to its bolt-action Kar98k, and Britain relied on the venerable Lee Enfield, the United States had taken a radical step forward. For the first time in history, a great power armed every one of its infantrymen with a semi-automatic rifle. The significance could not yet be measured. To many, it was simply a new piece of equipment. To John Garand, it was the culmination of a dream, a weapon that would, in time, change the very rhythm of war. If John Garand provided the vision, it was America's vast industrial might that turned that vision into reality. For a weapon to change a war, it had to be more than a prototype. It had to be produced by the millions, and it had to flow into the hands of soldiers faster than the enemy could destroy them. At the heart of this effort stood the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Since the days of George Washington, Springfield had been the forge of American military power, a symbol of the nation's ability to equip its citizen soldiers. When the M1 Garand was adopted in 1936, production began there on a modest scale. But as storm clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, the assembly lines expanded. Machines clattered, forges burned, and workers, many of them women stepping into factory roles for the first time, learned to shape, grind, and assemble the weapon that would soon march across continents. The rifle was no simple tool. Each Garand contained more than 70 precision-machined parts, all of which had to function flawlessly under the stresses of combat. Quality control was relentless. Inspectors checked tolerances down to the thousandth of an inch. A single misaligned piece could mean failure in the field. Springfield's production lines became a symphony of steel and discipline, a factory army working behind the soldiers at the front. As the war expanded, the demand grew too great for one facility alone. Winchester Repeating Arms joined the effort, and by 1943 both companies were producing rifles at a staggering pace. In the space of the war, over 4 million Garands would be delivered, enough to place one in the hands of nearly every American infantryman who fought in Europe or the Pacific. Contrast this with Germany. The Kar98k remained the mainstay of the Wehrmacht, produced in factories scattered across occupied Europe. Skilled but slower, their production was hampered by Allied bombing, shortages of raw materials, and the complexity of other weapon programs competing for resources. By 1944, German soldiers often marched into battle short of ammunition, or forced to carry weapons rebuilt from scavenged parts. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American factories were delivering rifles by the thousands every single day. The numbers told their own story. A fully equipped U.S. infantry division carried more firepower in its rifles alone than some entire German corps. And it was not just about quantity. It was about consistency. Each rifle leaving the line was tested, adjusted, and guaranteed to perform under the harshest conditions. Soldiers could trust their weapon, and that trust mattered. In the clang and smoke of American industry, the M1 Garand ceased to be an invention and became a phenomenon. It was no longer just the dream of John Garand. It was the embodiment of a nation's determination, a steel promise forged by the hands of thousands, shipped in crates to the far corners of the world. When the rifles arrived at the docks and were loaded onto ships bound for Warren, they carried with them more than firepower. They carried the industrial heartbeat of the United States, and a warning to Germany and Japan that this was a war they could not outproduce. November 1942. The dawn broke over the coasts of Morocco and Algeria as American soldiers prepared for their first major test of the war, Operation Torch. For most of them, this was their baptism of fire, the first time the young GIs would face the chaos of battle. Packed onto landing craft, their hands gripped the new rifles issued only months earlier, the M1 Garand. Few understood then how crucial this weapon would prove. As the ramps splashed down on the beaches, the Garand barked its first commands in combat. Against Vichy French defenders, and soon after, the hardened Afrika Korps, American riflemen found themselves thrust into a crucible of fire. The roar of German machine guns swept across the sand, and artillery plumes rose in columns of smoke. For Green American troops, fear was a constant companion. But when they raised their rifles and pulled the trigger, the Garand answered with speed and power beyond anything the enemy expected. French defenders reported with surprise that the Americans fired in steady streams, not in single cracks. German observers, too, began to notice. In after-action reports from Tunisia, officers noted the unsettling volume of fire American rifle companies could unleash. One German corporal described the moment bluntly. They fired as though each man had a machine gun. The Garand proved its worth not just in firepower, but in reliability. The desert sand clogged engines, jammed tracks, and fouled older rifles. Yet the Garand kept working. Its gas-operated system cycled cleanly, its rugged design enduring the grit of the Sahara. Soldiers quickly learned to trust it, to lean on its steady rhythm when chaos closed in. In the hills and wadis of Tunisia, inexperienced American units often faltered against Rommel's veterans. Tactics broke down, commanders hesitated, and morale wavered under counterattacks. But the rifle gave the infantry a fighting chance. Squads that might have been swept aside could lay down rapid fire, stalling advances, buying precious minutes until armor or artillery arrived. It was not perfection. The Americans still had much to learn, and Torch exposed painful weaknesses in training and leadership. Yet amid those early lessons, the M1 Garand stood out as one of the few clear advantages. In battlefields where the Germans carried the Kar98k, elegant but slow, the Americans carried the future. For the first time, the U.S. Army saw what it meant to march into war with a rifle a generation ahead of its peers. In North Africa, the Garand proved itself not merely a new weapon, but a force multiplier. The difference between collapse and survival, between retreat and holding the line. July 1943. Under the blazing Mediterranean sun, American landing craft scraped the beaches of Sicily. The men inside, now hardened by months of desert fighting, carried their Garands tightly across their chests. As the ramps dropped, they surged forward into a storm of German and Italian fire. Once again, the battlefield revealed the rifle's true power. In the narrow streets of Gela and the rocky hills that surrounded it, the Garand gave American infantrymen the edge they needed. German paratroopers and Italian defenders were seasoned, but when firefights broke out, the rhythm was unmistakable. The crack of bolt-action rifles came sporadically from enemy positions. In reply, the Garand thundered in steady, relentless bursts. 8 rounds, fired as fast as a man could squeeze the trigger, stitched across stone walls and dugouts, breaking the momentum of German counterattacks. Squads of GIs advanced behind that fire, laying down covering volleys that seemed almost ceaseless. By the time the campaign in Italy moved north into the mountains, the reputation of the Garand was firmly established among the troops. In the mud of Salerno and the frozen peaks of Monte Cassino, the rifle proved itself rugged beyond expectation. Soldiers described it as a companion they could trust. Rain, snow, or grit could wear down lesser weapons, but the Garand's design carried on, its piston-driven action cycling round after round through days of battle. German soldiers took notice. In captured diaries, Wehrmacht infantrymen wrote of the unceasing fire of American rifle units. Their own Kar98k rifles, though accurate at long range, demanded a pause. Bolt lifted, cartridge chambered, bolt slammed down. Each moment of hesitation, a chance for an American rifleman to fire 3 more shots. The imbalance was unmistakable. Then came June 6, 1944, Normandy. On the beaches of Omaha and Utah, under a rain of mortar shells and machine gun fire, the Garand became not just a tool, but a lifeline. Soldiers fighting their way off the sand knew that survival often hinged on the ability to return fire quickly, to suppress enemy positions long enough to crawl forward another few yards. Machine gun nests in the bluffs cut down wave after wave of men, yet squads that reached cover used their Garands to hammer back. Each rifleman, firing steadily, added his part to the overwhelming tide of American firepower. Paratroopers dropping into the bocage country of Normandy carried the rifle into hedgerows and villages, where combat turned brutal and close. In the thick green corridors, the Garand's rapid fire meant the difference between life and death. One soldier remembered the chaos of hedgerow ambushes. You didn't count shots, you just fired until the clip pinged out. That metallic ping, the distinctive sound of an empty clip ejecting, became etched into the memory of every GI. To some, it was a dreaded moment, the instant of vulnerability while reloading. To others, it was the heartbeat of battle, the rhythm of survival. The months that followed pushed American forces across France, from the fields of Normandy to the ruins of Saint-Lô, and later into the forests of the Ardennes. The Garand continued to define the battlefield. It was not flawless, but it was relentless, a weapon that made every infantryman more than just a rifleman. Together, they became a wall of fire, a rolling storm that German soldiers learned to fear. From Sicily to Normandy, the Garand had shed all doubts. It was not merely another rifle. It was the voice of the American army, steady and unbroken, carrying across Europe with a promise. The tide of firepower had turned, and with it, the course of the war. Behind every rifle was a man, cold, tired, afraid, and yet determined. For the American GI, the M1 Garand was not just another piece of issued equipment. It became a companion, a lifeline, and often the thin line between returning home and never leaving the battlefield. Letters from the front reveal the bond soldiers forged with their rifles. One infantryman wrote to his parents from Italy, "This rifle is my best friend. It never lets me down. I can keep firing when the Germans stop to reload. That's why I'm still alive." Such testimonies were not isolated. Time and again, GIs described the Garand with a mixture of respect and affection, a tool that gave them confidence in moments of terror. Acts of heroism often unfolded around it. At Monte Cassino, Sergeant Sylvester Antolak charged across 200 yards of open ground under machine gun fire, his Garand blazing until he fell, mortally wounded. For his sacrifice, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. In Normandy, Private Carlton Barrett waded through the surf at Omaha Beach again and again, dragging wounded men to safety. Between rescues, he fired his Garand to cover others, a weapon as steady in his hands as his courage in the chaos. The rifle's semi-automatic fire gave ordinary men extraordinary capability. Squads could hold out against overwhelming odds because each soldier could pour out sustained fire. In the hedgerows of France, when German counterattacks came crashing through the fields, American riflemen stood their ground, clip after clip slamming home, until the assault withered. Survivors later admitted that without the Garand, their unit would have been overrun. There were even moments of quiet irony. German soldiers, desperate and short of weapons, were known to scavenge captured Garands from the battlefield. Despite their training with the Kar98k, many recognized immediately the advantage of the American design. One U.S. soldier recalled finding a dead German sniper in Normandy, clutching not a Mauser, but an M1 Garand taken from an American casualty. For the GIs, the rifle became part of their identity. Its weight on their shoulder, the familiar kick against the stock, the sound of the clip ejecting. These sensations stitched themselves into memory. Decades later, veterans would still recall them with clarity. To hold a Garand again was to be transported back to the frozen forests of Belgium, the dusty lanes of Sicily, or the shell-torn beaches of Normandy. The human edge of the Garand was not in its steel or its mechanics, but in the confidence it gave to those who carried it. In a war where fear was constant and death never far, that confidence was priceless. It gave the American soldier the belief that, No matter how fierce the enemy, he had the firepower to endure, to fight, and to win. For the German soldier, battle in the West often began with confidence. They carried the Karabiner 98k, a rifle they considered the pinnacle of bolt-action design. Sturdy, precise, and deadly accurate, it had served them across Poland, France, and Russia. In the hands of a skilled marksman, it could pick off enemies at great distances with ruthless efficiency. But in 1943, as the Wehrmacht faced American forces in Italy, then in Normandy, the confidence began to erode. German after-action reports spoke with unease of the continuous fire of American rifle units. At first, commanders assumed that large numbers of submachine guns or hidden machine guns must be in use. Only gradually did they realize the truth, that every single American infantryman carried a semi-automatic rifle. For German squads, this revelation was a shock. Their doctrine centered on the machine gun as the anchor of the infantry section. Riflemen with bolt-action Kar98ks were trained to support the squad's MG34, or later MG42, which provided the real firepower. But in encounters with American units, the balance shifted. The Garand gave each U.S. soldier the ability to maintain suppressive fire independently. Suddenly, even without a machine gun team in place, American squads could pin down German positions with devastating effect. Letters from German soldiers reflected this bitter discovery. One corporal fighting in Normandy described American rifle fire as a wall that does not break. Another noted, "They fire and they fire again, faster than we can answer." For veterans hardened on the Eastern Front, where Soviet Mosin Nagants matched their own bolt actions shot for shot, the American rifle was something altogether different, a weapon that denied them the pauses and openings they relied on. The Wehrmacht did attempt to respond. In 1941, German engineers introduced the Gewehr 41, an early semi-automatic rifle, but it proved heavy, awkward, and prone to fouling. By 1943, the improved Gewehr 43 appeared, lighter and more reliable, and it was issued in growing numbers. Yet the effort came too late, and in too few quantities. Barely 400,000 G43s were produced, compared to millions of Garands flooding the American arsenal. Most German infantrymen never saw one, and continued to carry their bolt-action rifles until the war's end. In some engagements, German soldiers scavenged captured Garands, using them against their former owners. But such weapons were rare prizes, and ammunition supply was a constant problem. For the majority, the reality remained stark. Their standard rifle had been outclassed. The psychological impact was profound. Facing an enemy whose very rifle seemed to give him superiority at the most basic level of combat eroded confidence. The Kar98k still had its virtues: accuracy, ruggedness, and the skill of German marksmen. But in the storm of modern battle, it could not match the torrent of fire from the M1 Garand. For German infantrymen, the war against the Americans became a fight against time, firepower, and a rifle that symbolized the industrial and tactical weight of a new kind of warfare. The thunder of the Garand was not just a sound in the distance, it was the soundtrack of a battlefield where Germany's edge was slipping away. The Garand was more than a rifle. It was a force that reshaped the way American soldiers fought, from the smallest skirmish to the grand campaigns across Europe and the Pacific. Its semi-automatic fire changed tactics at the squad level, altered battlefield rhythm, and gave the U.S. Army an advantage that no other nation could match. Traditionally, infantry combat in Europe revolved around the machine gun. German doctrine epitomized this. Each squad was built around its MG34 or later MG42, with riflemen maneuvering to protect the gun team and feed it ammunition. Bolt-action rifles like the Kar98k supported the machine gun's bursts, but rarely dictated the pace. Combat was a contest of suppression. Whichever side's machine gun dominated the field usually dictated the outcome. The M1 Garand shifted that balance. With every American rifleman capable of firing 8 rounds in rapid succession, a single U.S. squad could generate a volume of fire once reserved for machine gun sections. Instead of waiting for a Browning automatic rifle or a water-cooled M1917 to be brought up, American units could instantly lay down suppressive fire, pinning the enemy while flanking maneuvers developed. In the hedgerows of Normandy, this advantage became decisive. German soldiers entrenched behind earthen banks expected to face the slow rhythm of bolt-action fire. Instead, when contact came, Garands hammered in synchronized bursts from every direction. One U.S. sergeant recalled, "We didn't need to wait for the BAR to move up. Every man's rifle spoke as fast as his finger. That's how we broke them loose from the hedges." This tactical flexibility allowed U.S. commanders to think differently. Fire and movement, once dependent on crew-served weapons, became a standard expectation for all riflemen. An American platoon could spread across a wide front, knowing that each man could deliver continuous fire without pause. In defense, Garand-armed units absorbed counterattacks that might have shattered formations reliant on slower rifles. In offense, they pressed forward aggressively, never giving the enemy a lull to regroup. Statistics reinforced the impact. A single U.S. rifle squad could deliver up to 150 aimed rounds per minute, far outstripping the 40 to 50 rounds a German squad might expect from its bolt-action rifles alone. While the MG-42 remained formidable, its dominance was blunted when American rifle fire pressed from multiple angles, forcing German gunners to duck rather than fire. The Garand also reshaped morale. Soldiers knew they could depend on their weapon not only for accuracy, but for volume. This confidence translated into boldness, a willingness to attack fortified positions, to stand ground under artillery, to engage even when outnumbered. Commanders noticed the difference. Units armed with Garands were far more likely to hold fast under pressure, because every soldier felt he had the tools to fight back. Even American allies took note. British and Commonwealth troops, still carrying Lee-Enfield rifles, admired the sheer firepower their American counterparts could deliver. Many privately envied the weapon, and some swapped whenever battlefield conditions allowed. By the war's end, military thinkers understood what the Garand had proven, that the age of the bolt-action rifle was over. Infantry combat would never again be measured in deliberate single shots. The future belonged to the semi-automatic, and soon after, to the fully automatic assault rifle. The M1 Garand had not just armed soldiers, it had transformed the doctrine of modern war, teaching armies that firepower could be carried not only by machines, but by every man who shouldered a rifle. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the M1 Garand stood as more than a weapon of its age. It was a symbol of how innovation, industry, and determination could tip the balance of history. 4 million of these rifles had marched across Europe and the Pacific, carried by ordinary men who achieved extraordinary things. But its story did not end with the surrender of Germany and Japan. The Garand followed American soldiers into the cold winds of Korea, where it cracked across the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir. Against Chinese human wave attacks, U.S. Marines and Army infantrymen relied once more on its relentless rhythm, pouring fire into the darkness to break assault after assault. Even in those desperate nights, veterans called it the rifle that saved them. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, the Garand remained a fixture of American arsenals, gradually replaced by the M14 and later the M16. Yet long after new rifles took the stage, the Garand remained in the hands of allies, from South Korea to Greece, from Italy to the Philippines. Its wood and steel carried across continents, a trusted companion in conflicts far removed from the fields of Normandy. Its influence shaped the very language of firearms design. The M14, essentially an evolution of the Garand, retained its gas system and much of its rugged character. Even the M16, though a leap into a new era, was born in a military culture that had learned the value of firepower in every soldier's hands. For the men who carried it, the Garand was never forgotten. Decades later, veterans of Normandy, Sicily, and the Bulge spoke of its weight, its recoil, and the unmistakable metallic ping of an empty clip. To them, it was the sound of survival, the voice of comrades who never returned, and of battles that defined their generation. General George S. Patton had once called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. History proved him right. The Garand was not simply a tool of war. It was an expression of America's belief that technology, courage, and mass determination could overcome even the fiercest enemy. Its legacy endures, not only in museums or collectors' hands, but in the living memory of a rifle that helped free a world in chains.